supporting this particulate, pointillistic, materialistic school of explanation began, in fact, to betray it, because the analysis of matter was pushed to deeper and deeper levels until finally phenomena began to be elucidated, which seemed incomprehensible in the mechanical model. It seemed as though what had been thought of as points of matter were in fact spread through time, and the notion of simple location began to give way to talk of clouds of probability and this sort of thing. All of this reaching a culmination in 1923 with the Copenhagen Conference on Quantum Physics, where basically a new vision of matter was elucidated. And strangely enough, the new view of matter seemed to have a very mentalist sort of aura about it. It no longer was a theory of simple location, calculable energies, and specific predictions. It was probabilistic. Now, this reemergence of the need for a wave mechanical description of matter can, I think, now be seen from the vantage point of 55 years as the first stirrings, or among the first stirrings, of the reemergence of the spirit. And I think that what understanding and imagination in the light of nature argues for is the presence and reemergence of the awareness of spirit in the world. This is what the so-called and long-heralded paradigm shift is all about. It is a vast turning over of the intellectual universe, which will eclipse many idea systems and support many more. It is the idea of fields. Spirit need not be defined or even conceived in any sort of 19th century or mentalist or animist way. What spirit is a field of deployed energy that is somehow co-present at more than one point in space and time. It is the shadow that haunts the particularized world of Newtonian matter. And it is, strangely enough, the commonest object of experience. In other words, as we move through our lives, as we project our hopes, as we plan our days, as we execute our jobs, we move in this realm of spirit. The problem is that we have been very slowly but very efficiently corralled inside an intellectual system which gives no credence to spirit, and therefore has had a curious effect on the validation that we give our own lives. For instance, if you look at positivist philosophy, which is the dominant philosophical paradigm in academic philosophy, there you learn that there are primary and secondary qualities to the world. And the primary qualities are charge, spin, angular momentum, velocity, this sort of thing. Things which nowhere come tangential to the felt world of the individual. Well, then there are also so-called secondary qualities: color, taste, tone, feeling, all the things that make up the world that you and I experience. So somehow we are not traveling in first class on this metaphysical airliner. You know, we're back there with the secondary qualities, and the good stuff is all up front, and it is described and manipulated by incomprehensible equations, and you have to enter into a priesthood to become part of it. Well, it's to our credit, I think, that we are waking up. And one of the reasons that we are waking up is because into the objects of common experience, by an exhaustive search of the objects of common experience, diligent, clear-thinking seekers after understanding, people who are practicing, who took seriously the Constitution's assurance of the pursuit of happiness, have, Robert Bork notwithstanding, have found more than the right of privacy in the Constitution, but have actually found the right to alter your own consciousness for purposes of personal growth. Well, consciousness is like a still pool. If it is unperturbed, it returns a clear image of the world, in the same way that the unperturbed surface of a pond will become a mirror to the environment around it. But if consciousness is perturbed by being shifted from its ordinary modalities, then the extraordinarily tenuous and provisional nature of what we call reality swims into our ken. And we see, that what we take to be solid objects, what we take to be here and now, what we take to be personal identity versus other, in the form of other personalities, that all of these things hang by the most tenuous of linguistic threads and cultural conventions. And that beneath the surface of those conventions is utter terra incognito, a no man's land, the unexplored territory behind cultural assumptions, suddenly, starkly, totally, incontrovertibly illuminated to the inspection of the individual.
Illuminated.
Well, this is feeding. Indeed, to my mind, it is the major factor responsible for the reemergence of the awareness of the spirit. It holds out the possibility that we can create a new definition of our own humanness, that it was fine for purposes of disentangling from the medieval church to take the materialist route and to follow it into Darwinian evolution, to recognize our ascent from previous primate forms, and to sort of claim a dimension of existential freedom. But that is not the whole story. That essentially is the legacy or the achievement of modernism, which was fully worked out by 1927 or 8, I would say. I mean, those people, the pataphysicians, the quantum physicists, the Dadaists, the surrealists, Alfred Jarry, André Breton, it was all worked out. And those of us who were born after that time and have come into this sort of pseudo-eschaton of regurgitation of modern values in art, fashion, and literature have been living in this kind of a goldfish bowl ever since. I mean, really, it's astonishing the degree to which, in the most progressive and fast-moving century in the last 10 or 20, for that matter, there has also been an extraordinary backward
thing? Why is it so small? You know what I'm
saying? Very strong
recidivism
that has held at bay the true exfoliation of what modernity was supposed to mean. That's why within the 20th century, the further back you go, the more utopian the projection of the future becomes. And the further into the 20th century you go, the more like a dystopia it becomes, as we get not elevated railways, immortality, and hot pants, but bread lines and germ warfare and doublespeak and all of these things. So into this situation of retrenchment and cultural recidivism and the working out of modern values, which are materialist values, comes then the beginning of the postmodern era. I prefer a different term, which I call compressionism. The compressionist era, which follows the modern era. And its theme is the reemergence of the presence of the spirit, and its major cultural exhibit, or the major cultural force driving it, is the discovery of relativism with regard to consciousness, which does not only mean psychedelic drugs and hallucinogenic plants per se, it also means media, it also means literary expectation, reorientation of the senses through design, urban planning, the entire spectrum of effects which feeds consciousness back into itself is enunciating this theme of the emergent spirit. And it is not necessarily a welcome theme, because all institutions attain a certain momentum toward the preservation of their own vested interests.
I don't think Vader
science,
will look good, but we'll see.
And the handmaiden of science, which is modern technocratic government, have created a number of cultural institutions that have a friction with the reemergence of the spirit. First and foremost is the notion of the public. The public is this weird idea that was generated in the wake of the printing press, that there were vast numbers of people who could be treated atomistically. They didn't have to be thought of as individuals. They could be thought of as various classes, masses of people to be manipulated. And if you could sell the public on the idea of democracy, which is another one of these atomistic notions. The notion of democracy is that for us all to get together and have it work, we have to assume that we're all alike, see? So we each have a vote, and then you may be tall, you may be short, you may be rich, you may be poor, you may be black, you may be white, but that doesn't matter. We'll give everybody this charge, one vote, and then we'll see how these populations work themselves out. What they don't tell you is that at the same time that you build this definition of the citizen, you also build the institutions which subvert the citizen. So the citizen is not free to act out and express the wishes of the citizen. The citizen is a consumer of ideological models that are sold to the citizen through agencies of mass propaganda. So there's this peculiar playing off of one against the other. In the meantime, what has also been happening is the institutions of language, which previously were pretty much left to develop on their own, and that was the situation well into the 19th century. Through the power of the printing press, the evolution of language also became something under the control of these institutions, and they very quickly have replaced whatever reality may have been impinging into the lives of the citizens with concepts. Concepts replace reality. You come into the world with a blank slate, and everything is what William James called a blooming, buzzing confusion. Well, then one by one, you isolate phenomena in this confusion, and you name it. Once a sector of reality has been named, it stays still. It ceases to behave the way it would behave for itself. It begins to behave syntactically. because it has been changed into a linguistic object. When things behave syntactically, they are either subjects or objects, or the syntactical machinery which relates these two together. In that case, materialism, dualism, projection of authenticity beyond the self are all reinforced. So these are the factors which have impeded the spirit. Into this comes the psychedelic experience. It has a tremendous force to revivify the spirit, particularly because it is not an ideology. It is not something someone figured out. It is an experience. And this is important to bear in mind. It horrifies me, I'm sure you've heard me say it, to think of someone going from birth to the grave without ever coming tangential to the psychedelic experience. It's like going from the birth to the grave without ever discovering sex. It means that you died as a pre-adolescent. You know, you never really came into your birthright. And we have been infantilized by our cultural institutions to accept the notion of ourselves as citizens consuming these regurgitated scientific models, which are then hashed through by Madison Avenue and then handed down to us by the organs of mass culture. And this is supposed to be what we anchor our lives on. It's no wonder that drug abuse, child abuse, self-abuse is rampant in this society, because it all has been taken away from us. You may read 1984 and think, well, thank God it isn't that bad yet. Well, the only difference between us and 1984 is we dress better. So I think that little gatherings like this, and I feel like this is definitely a family gathering, this meeting was sold out before there was any promo other than Roy's show and a small mailing we did. So you are people who have passed through a very narrow filter. You stay up late. You listen to KPFK, and you tolerate Terance McKenna. So you are either thrice blessed or thrice cursed. I don't know which it is. But anyway, it feels to me like a family gathering. It feels to me like we are figuring this out, and there aren't that many of us, I think. But what we understand as a group, or what I imagine that we understand, is that there is this twilight of reductionism. There is this end of the old model. And yet we're not ready to proclaim the twilight of reductionism to simultaneously be the funeral of reason. You see, there are a lot of people, a much larger group than we represent, who are prepared to bury reason along with reductionism. And I think reason may have been caught in bed with reductionism, but it may have been set up, is the take that I have on it. And is, as they used to say in Watergate, linked but not tainted. So I am a very, someone said I was I was accused of being narrow-minded the other night. Because I come to this very honestly through the sciences, through trying to really find out what was going on and not just accept everything that came down the pike. I mean, I will believe anything if there's evidence, if it's self-consistent, if the case is well made. I mean, I think that the first thing the truth will be is a pleasure to hear. and not some turgid and tormented thing where you have to go to 6 meetings and not talk to anybody who doesn't believe it and all of this sort of thing. So I think it's important as what I call the archaic revival gets rolling. It is important for us to clarify where we are coming from. When we were simply the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe, it hardly mattered. But responsibility will devolve on us to say what we mean and to have a position which is not only convincing to the converted, but convincing to the skeptics. That's who I'm after, because I think that a great instance of cultural blindness is what we're confronted with on the issue of psychedelics. Psychedelics are to the science of psychology what the telescope was to astronomy in Galileo's time. And we are in a situation of increasing global pressure on our species, increasing outbreaks of neurosis, unhappiness, psychic epidemics, and we are leaving our best tools behind because of fairly preposterous cultural prohibitions. Cultural prohibitions which deny us our best weapons for overcoming the situation that we are in.
Should have read that before
and
I
this
clicked
is
it.
really an intolerable situation because the fate, nothing less than the fate of the human species, probably hangs in the balance. We cannot afford the luxury of an unconscious. We cannot afford stupidity, closed-mindedness, racism, sexism, consumer materialism, selfishness, an absence of globalism. These things are not necessary for us, for our moral edification, so that we can feel like well-bred ladies and gentlemen. These things are necessary for us so that we don't destroy ourselves. And the fact that this message is so slow coming out is a strong argument for activism on the part of anybody who thinks they have even the faintest glimmer of what is going on. The future will not wait. I see the most crypto-fascist and intransigent of institutions slowly waking up to fairly basic facts, such as that a nuclear war is probably a bad investment. So that even as Neanderthal a type as President Pinocchio is willing. Isn't that a cruel thing for me to say? Is waking up to the fact that it just don't pay. But we have a lot of problems. It isn't going to be the millennium, even if we achieve a massive cutback in strategic weapons. There's still going to be propaganda, sexism, starvation, inability to correctly manage resources. These things will plague us unto the last syllable of recorded time, unless we begin to undergo this kind of intellectual cohesion, the compression of our intent, the recognition of our group-mindedness as a feeling, as a will that can act in the historical context. And to my mind, the psychedelics have always existed in the plants to promote precisely this. There were not language-using, tool-making tribes of human beings in the absence of hallucinogenic plants. The hallucinogenic plants create the context for integrated organizational activity. This has been going on for at least 15, 20,000 years. The problem is that through a series of factors, which we needn't go into in depth here, but factors which impinged on European civilization particularly, civilizations were able to evolve outside of the noetic input from Gaia, outside of the biological radio that envelops the planet and inputs into balanced tribal societies with functioning shamanic institutions. In Europe, somehow the chain was broken. The link back to the elder gods and goddesses and to the biological organization of human society before history was lost. And this curious kind of ungoverned intellectual development occurred, ungoverned in the literal sense of a machine which slips from the control of its governor. And in that situation, materialism, which is an insupportable philosophy actually if you have an openness, a sensitivity, any kind of cultivated feminine response to nature, it is utterly impossible. Recall that the point of view of Cartesian materialism pushed Descartes to actually claiming in public debate that animals were machines. He said they feel nothing. The apparent display of pain is simply something which we project onto them, because we alone have a soul. And Descartes, you see, himself had not gone over completely to materialism. He believed there was a human soul, but it came tangential at only one point to the human body. Somewhere in the pineal gland there was a switch, and the soul was running things like a telephone switchboard operator from there. Well, very shortly after Descartes, his followers just said, well, we don't need this. This soul concept was just a thing to stay on the right side of the church, and we don't need it, and they cut it loose. And, well, once you cut that loose, then you have all kinds of permission. You have permission to rape and exploit nature, permission which had already been reinforced for Western man by the New Testament, but now raised to the nth degree by the assumption that nature is utterly without soul. And this philosophy persisted well into the 1950s. The essence of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism can be summed up in the statement, nature is mute. That was Sartre's position on nature. How many people thinking themselves existentialists and hanging out in coffee houses actually ever worked through what the consequences of the existential point of view was? Nature is not mute. You really have to have worked yourself into a weird place to believe that, you know. In fact, nature is entirely something else. Nature is communication, because nature is psyche. This is what we haven't understood. We have somehow talked ourselves into the belief that into the natural world of Eden,
where the hell did they go?
God came and made man, and from man woman, and that men and women are of so ontologically a different level than the rest of nature that no conclusion about us can be drawn from an examination of nature. Nothing could, it's impossible for me to understand how this idea persists and has such momentum in the 20th century, where hierarchy theory has very, very clearly explicated the notion of the linkage of higher order systems to subsystems that are
Open.
physically more simple. So you see, really what we have is a kind of fractal universe. In fact, it's not greatly different from the alchemical view of the 16th century, where people said, as above, so below. The microcosm is a reflection of the macrocosm. What this is really saying is that at the level of a planet, you get a certain level of organization and spectrum of peripheral effects. The same thing, such as self-reflection, self-regulation, intent, goal projection, steering toward perceived goals. You get the same kind of thing on the level of a society, can be a beehive or a herd of antelope or whatever, and you get it in the human individual and the human society. So really what is to be seen is that we are the cutting edge of becoming. We are not a thing apart. We are a unique level.
I'm going to have to listen to this shit, I'm sure.
Howdy. Since we were talking about it earlier, I'm going to use this new video recorder to show you how to make Star Wars text in Photoshop quickly and easily. You're going to start by creating a new document, so go ahead and press Control-N. I'm selecting the default Photoshop size here, so just go ahead and click OK. So you get this real basic window here. The first thing that you want to do is you want to use your horizontal type tool to just go ahead and type out whatever text it is that you want to Star Warsify. Make sure it's not quite as wide as the document because you're about to be widening it a bit. Alright, once you've done that, you want to, I'll bring in my layers palette to show you what I'm doing here. You want to click off the layer and then click it again so that you've targeted the layer, but you're not selecting the text right there.
What is going on?
Alright, so now what you want to do is go to Layer, Type, layer. Here, so just go ahead and click OK. So you get this real basic window here. The first thing that you want to do is you want to use your horizontal type tool to just go ahead and type out whatever text it is that you want to Star Warsify. Make sure it's not quite as wide as the document because you're about to be widening it a bit. Alright, once you've done that, you want to, I'll bring in my layers palette to show you what I'm doing here. You want to click off the layer and then click it again so that you've targeted the layer, but you're not selecting the text right there. Alright, so now what you want to do is go to Layer, Type, Convert to Shape. And that's just so you can edit it without it looking really stretched out or looking too pixelated. Alright, so press Control-T to go into Free Transform mode. Right-click over the text, click Perspective, and go to one of these bottom corner handles. Hold down your Alt key and drag outward from there. And you'll see you get these outlines showing you that it's being dragged out. Quite as wide as the document because you're about to be widening it a bit. Alright, once you've done that, in here.
He might be using impact. He didn't really tell us what font he was using. Kind of looks like it, right? Okay, cool. Feel the force in the bass drop. And give me a second here. I'll go back to what he was talking about.
You want to click off the layer and then click it again so that you've targeted the layer, but you're not selecting the text right there. All right. So now what you want to do is go to Layer, Type, Convert to Shape. And that's just so you can edit it without it looking really stretched out or looking too pixelated. All right, so press Control T to go into free transform mode. Right-click over the text, click Perspective, and go to one of these bottom corner handles to selecting the text right there. All right, so now what you want to do is go to Layer, Type, Convert to Shape. And that's...
Let's see if we do have that here. Layer. We're looking at a new section here. Image. Oh, there's just type right here instead of layer.
You can edit it without it looking really stretched out or looking too pixelated. All right, so press Control T to go into free transform mode. Right-click over the text, click.
Skew isn't even one of the ones that are on there. Scale, none of that is on there. See, I don't think shit is the same as it used to be.
Press Control T to go into free transform mode. Right-click over the text.
Yeah, see, I don't need to do that anymore. I can just go right here, and that's free transform. Now I can right-click. It's hard to do when this video must be old as fuck.
Click
2006.
Perspective, and go to one of these bottom corner handles.
Perspective. I don't think this is working. I have to go find another fucking video because that dude's shit is fucking ancient. Damn. What's going on here? Look at that. Oh, there we go. What the fuck?
Hold down your Alt key and drag outward from there, and you'll see you get these outlines showing you that it's being dragged out. So once you've done that with your Alt key still held down, go to one of the top handles, drag them in towards the center just a bit, don't want to overdo it too much.
Oh, that's dope. So far, so good. Except for the fucking color. That needs to be fixed. Straight up. Overlay. Might just put it really yellow like this. Make it so you can kind of see it.
And once you're done with that, press enter. You'll see you still got these little things around the text that shows you that it's a shape. So once you're done, you go to Layer, Rasterize, Shape, and there you go. You have your Star Wars text. You can add a layer style to it, like a drop shadow, because why would you add a drop shadow? Well, because you can. So go ahead and add a drop shadow, because I always add drop shadows. And you're about done there. So there's how to create basic Star Wars text in Photoshop.
Basic. No,
and I hope maybe you learned something along the way, and I hope that you enjoy.
I'm out of here. Back to Terance McKenna.
Of a multi-level organism. And we have been called forth out of nature, by nature, for a purpose. And what is our task as individuals, I think, is to discover what that purpose is, and then to align ourselves with it in a way which allows the plan, whatever it is, to most smoothly unfold. Well, what it seems to be is a progressive invocation of spirit, the theme with which I began the evening, that through language, through abstraction, through magical invocation, the formulation of religions, the projection of art, the field phenomena, the phenomena which are diffuse in space and time and not easily located, are forcing or intruding their way into three-dimensional space and time. If you were an extraterrestrial in a starship in orbit around this planet, what you would see looking down
it is beautiful.
Is a gene swarm. The species that seem to us to be animal forms, extremely stable in time, are actually highly permeable membranes over millennia and tens of millennia, with genes crossing over, moving around, and being basically obedient to the expression of some kind of teleological form. And it was the concern of 19th century biology to eliminate teleology, to eliminate purpose and directedness.
There you go.
But it's very hard to avoid the impression of some kind of attractor ahead of this planet, embedded in its history, and somehow channeling everything toward it, so that the progressive acceleration of human society, of information production, of communication, the proliferation of languages, natural and synthetic, all of these things are not something going on in the human domain and somehow sealed from the general state of nature, but are in fact part of the general state of nature. And the human experience, or the human animal, as the carrier of this catalytic process, this speeding up and accelerating a process on the surface of the planet, is not sealed from nature, but the leading edge of a process on this planet. Now, teleology was so antithetical to 19th century science because they were trying to pull away from the telos of medieval scholastic philosophy. They didn't want God, these 19th century English atheists, Darwin and Lyle and that crowd. However, we have come through the so-called death of God and the elimination of a theological raison d'etre for the universe. And now we're looking more at a telos which we would operationally define, rather than define it based on ancient revelation, which was the previous method was the older the book, the truer it must be, and the Bible is the oldest book, and therefore it must be true. This is what Mircea Eliade calls the nostalgia for paradise, paradigm of time. We are overcoming that. It can now be seen that there is, in fact, some kind of transcendental object. And it's best to try and describe it phenomenologically. We don't know what it is, but we do know that it's an enormous attractor of some sort. And we are in the field of attraction. And by we, I mean all life on the planet is being drawn into this nodal point. And it is possible to anticipate it through the psychedelic experience, because apparently the natural and the linguistic world are worlds which are organized along the principle of fractal curves. Fractal curves are recently discovered mathematical objects. Not all of them are recently discovered. Some were known as late as the late 19th century, but most have been discovered using computers in the last 10 or 15 years. And they are self-similar curves such that when you take a subset of one of these mathematical objects, it is found to have the whole pattern embedded in it. The Fourier transforms that describe holograms are these kind of things. Coastlines, mountain ranges, data of all sorts, when analyzed in a certain way, is found to be fractal. Apparently, the world is a kind of vast spiral fractal that is achieving greater and greater closure with itself. And we experience this density of closure and this compressionism as the spectrum of effects which we call human evolution, human history, emergence of high technology, the present moment, the rush toward apocalypse. The most intense moments that the universe has ever known are the next 15 seconds. And beyond that lies still more intense moments. Novelty as a kind of generalized paradigm of the compression of connectedness throughout the cosmos is accelerating moment by moment in the rocks, in the trees, in the stars, and in us. And so what we call history, which is not as modern, the modern theory of history is that it's what they call trendlessly fluctuating. That's their model of the world. You get order at the atomic level, order at the biological level, order, and suddenly you reach human beings, trendlessly fluctuating. It's as though, we were Brownian, affected by the Brownian movement of random particles, and yet we somehow, out of all this ordering, we're to believe that then emerges the trendless fluctuation of human history. Actually, this is nonsense. It's simply that there has never been a thoroughgoing theory of history. However, now we are ready for them, because these wave mechanical ideas, the notions of closure, Sheldrake's idea about the presence of the past, the way in which the past drives the present, all of these things lay us open for an understanding of the compression and densification of time. And this is what is experienced in the psychedelic experience. Really, Whitehead said of Dove Gray that it haunts time like a ghost. Well, I think that the compression of the three-dimensional universe at the end of time haunts time like
I
a
didn't know I
ghost.
could do that. No, I
It's
do.
the cosmic giggle. Here a messiah, there a shaman, there an ecstatic poet, and there the tiny ripple that is simply a congruent coincidence in the life of a single individual. Robert Anton Wilson called this the cosmic giggle. It's when something protrudes through the forward-flowing momentum of rational casuistry and causes it to flow around it and eddy and churn, and then you see through for a moment, and you say, well, what is it? There was a plottedness for a moment. There was the hand of the maker there, but now I don't see it anymore. That is the going behind the veil. That is the seeing into the structure of being that lies behind the conventionalized languages. That's why coincidence is so often reported as an accompanying phenomenon for the psychedelic experience, because really syntax is dissolved, and syntax is a filter for this sense of eminent connectedness. And when the syntax goes, the eminent connectedness flows in. Then it's a question of what you do with it. If it causes you to believe that you are going to save the world, then you haven't gotten the message right. That's inflation. And inflation is very bad. It drives up interest rates. So if you get that kind of a take on it, you are misusing it. Nevertheless, the most advanced yogic techniques that are known are the techniques of the so-called Anuttara Yoga Tantra, the tantric yogic techniques. And there, the prescription is, it says in Herbert Gunther's Treasures of the Tibetan Middle Way, you should think of your house as a resplendent palace. Think of your utensils as made of beaten gold, and think of yourself as having a body made of living mercury. What this is, in Western psychological terms, is an invitation to inflation. But if it is approached with the right analysis of mind, basically that there is nothing but Bodhi mind and there is no particularization in time and space, then there is no inflationary feedback into the ego. And this is the kind of opportunity that the psychedelic opens up. It is, I've said many times, quoting Plato, time is the moving image of eternity. Time is the moving image of eternity. What the shaman does is he or she leaves the mundane plane, and in Iliad's phrase, is able to trigger a rupture of plane. And the rupture of plane carries the shamanizing person into another dimension, literally another dimension. And in that other dimension, all of time and space is beheld, as James Joyce said, in a nutshell. And in the nutshell of time and space, everything is seen to be a part and a aesthetically pleasing, integral, necessary part of the transcendental object. In fact, what this universe is a lower dimensional slice of that same transcendental object. Well, I guess what impels my career and what I really can't get over is that what I'm saying to you is true. You know? That, I mean, we sit here, we gather here, and even though we're talking about this extremely far out thing, still all the forms are in place. I'm here, you're there, Everybody sits on their ass. Nobody sits on their head. It all appears fairly mundane. How can it be that what we are talking about is the nearby presence of an impossibly alien dimension? Now, if that alien dimension had been reported back to us by a robot probe dropped into the methane oceans of Europa, we would be all hot to go there, to organize a $20 billion expedition and a 15-year plan and go out there and find out what is happening. The amazing thing is that, each one of us in our own living room can be this Magellan, can penetrate into these dimensions. It really seems quite freaky to me. Freaky to me that such a thing is possible, and yet that we are such monkeys, or so culturally constrained, or so blind, that this is not what we're all talking about all the time. And by we all, I mean all 5 billion of us on this planet, because we appear to be being pushed down a featureless corridor toward a furnace. And yet, if you would notice, there are all these doors along the side of the so-called featureless corridor. And nobody seems to have cognized that you can just open these doors and walk through and short-circuit the inevitability of planetary disaster. Amazing. Amazing. Because we pride ourselves on our commitment that science allows us to look anywhere, inspect any possibility. Our models are not dictated to us by the church or by government or by industry, when in fact they are dictated to us by the church, government, industry, mammalian organization. And so we are no better off than all those benighted people in those previous ages, where we look back upon them and say, well, they must have been so limited by their worldview because they didn't know about quantum physics and ketamine and Michael Jackson and cable TV and all of these things. But the fact of the matter is that unless we push through culture to nature, we too are dupes.
What the hell?
We too are somehow being sold a line. And yet nature is there, outside of the cities. You drive an hour and a half from where we're sitting and you're in the high desert, and it is demon-haunted Paleolithic space. It holds the same promise for us as moderns that it held for the Luiseno Indians, who were initiated into their shamanic institution before the conquest, before history. So nature is the final arbiter of cultural forms. This is what Taoism understood, and this is what I believe the psychedelic plant thing is pushing us toward. It was not immediately apparent that this was so, because as I said at the beginning of this talk, in the 60s, the psychedelics came out of the laboratory, and only the most scholarly of the trippers bothered to study the natural origins and the anthropological and ethnographic context in which these things were coming from, like the Eleusinian mysteries or the Mexican morning glory mysteries or the Wasson discovered mushroom mysteries. But if we can somehow link a respect to nature, a sensitivity to Gaia, a valuing of ourselves, a complete placing of our own feelings and our own perceptions in the forefront of trustworthy sources, and the psychedelics integrated into our lives, then there will be a tremendous cultural impact, a tremendous reorientation, because the message that nature is trying to give, the steering signal on the human species, comes through the accessing of this shamanic dimension outside of history. Revolutions are made
What the
by
fuck?
tiny
Why am I only
percentages
getting
of the
one
populations
letter? That's so
in which
weird.
those
That is
revolutions
under
are
typing.
wrought. The important thing is
That
clarity
reader typing.
and connectedness and a
Where?
clear understanding
Book.
of who one's antecedents are, what the source antecedents are, and what the target goal is. New Age is a pale label for what is going on. New Age sounds too much like New Nixon, New Reagan, new retreaded everything. What is happening is an archaic revival, a harking back to cultural models 10 to 25,000 years old, because the profane fall into history is actually ending. The way the fall into history ends is with the progeny of Adam, the human race, recovering the control of the human form, the control of the human soul, the ability to turn ourselves into whatever we wish to be. This comes through the union of imagination, through understanding, into nature, the invocation of the dream. This is what the Australian Aboriginal Society is talking about. This is what the dream time is. Finnegan's Wake says, up nient, prospector, you warp your woof and spread your wings, sprout all your work. This up nient, this end of time, this birth into angelhood lies ahead of us, but it is really part of the archaic return to the paradisical mode before history. The psychedelic hallucinogens are the catalysts. The minds that they touch become the catalysts within the society in general. And from there, the fashions, the social forms, the kinds of conscientiousness, the innate decency that is called forth by the authenticity of the experience is what will transform us. I mean, in the same way that an affair can become a love affair if there is mutual authenticity of behavior rather than simply a kind of flirtation. In that same way, our affair with Gaia can be a love affair if we can summon to ourselves the vision to make it so. And it means really being aware of the vastness of the options, of the precipice that late 20th century historical human beings stand on. We are about to leave for the stars. This is what is happening on this planet. A species prepares to depart for the stars. To do that, energy has to be marshaled. The lessons of the long march out of the trees and to this moment have to be collated, sifted, refined, concentrated. That is the alchemical gold. The historical process is the story of a prodigal son, of a wandering and a return. The return is meaningless without the wandering. The wandering has no meaning unless its fruits are given birth after the return. And I think that the last 1,000 years has been the prodigal journey into matter. And it ends finally with modern pharmacology, modern ethnobotany, discovering in the jungles of the Amazon and the mountains of Mexico the body of Eros, Osiris, fallen since the time of the flood, but awaiting the re-emergence of the cognizant human connection. That is what the archaic revival holds out. It's actually our salvation. I mean, I think I'm fairly hard-nosed. I don't see any hope for us. I don't see any hope for institutional transformation unless it is done with an awareness of the transcendental object. And the religions that we inherit from the past are so screwed up that the only way to validate and empower the transcendental object is by self-experience, by direct accessing. And people say, well, but can't it be done on the natch? No, it can't be done on the natch, generally speaking, because if it could be, it would have been done. I mean, there are plenty of elder societies on this planet who have the rap down, but look at the kind of societies that they erect. I mean, horrifyingly dehumanized societies seem to be the breeding place of the most sublime religions there are. So, no, I think there has to be a humbling. We have to bow our heads and abandon the dualism that we inherit out of Christianity and science and the whole Judeo-Christian Islamic shtick. We have to realize that it requires a symbiotic partner. It's a hand-in-hand effort. And if we are willing to take the hand which nature offers in the strange form of the alien vegetation spirit from the stars that seems to infuse us on plant hallucinogens, then we will go forward into a bright new world. It's a partnership. It's a challenge. It's the only game in the planetary village. Really? And I appreciate your letting me share with you my notion of it this evening. Thank you.
Killed it.
We're going to take about a 10 or 15 minute break and then do question and answers. There are a bunch of handouts, catalogs, events coming up, stuff on tables at the back of the room, which I urge you to take a look at. Yeah? We're going to start very quickly because the Philosophical Society has asked that we wind ourselves down. I wanted to call your attention to a couple of things before I take questions. Psilocybin, the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, is back in print by popular demand, and at health food stores you buy agar. But I do technical consulting for a hefty hourly fee. But this can be gotten at Bodhi Tree. It's longer, it's on better paper, it has more drawings. It's as state-of-the-art as we could make it. It has brought freedom, prosperity, and enlightenment to tens of thousands. We have, not to be outdone by Tim Leary, we have a piece of software.
Bam, look at that.
So if you own a 2E, 2C, or 2GS machine from Apple, well, you can run this time wave software, which in my opinion is actually my best trick, and I will be writing and talking more and more about the wave of time, because in Hawaii, finally developing this software gave me a real grip on it. Eventually we will market this for Macintosh and IBM compatible machinery, but right now it's in the 2E2C line. Also, I'd like to mention that Kat and I will be at Esalen next weekend, so if any of you are true gluttons for punishment, why, you can join us up there for 2.5 days, and it should be lots of fun. That will wind this all up. And before I take questions, I want to again remind you of Botanical Dimensions. It is a tax-exempt nonprofit. We do need donations. All the money that is given goes very directly into visibly manifesting the botanical garden in Hawaii, collecting the plants, building a computer database, and basically not even supporting, but keeping a Peruvian collector in the field. Since I'm most familiar with Amazonian botany, why, that's where we've concentrated. Well, usually questions are the most interesting. How is this to be done? Are you going to hand a microphone? Do people come up? Stand up? Stand up and speak loudly. In the middle, in the back. Yes.
Yes, Terrence. I was wondering if you could share with us your ideas on what spirit is.
Well, I think it's my notion of it is it's that the way we experience it, it's an informing understanding. It's on one level, it's simply appropriate activity.
God damn it keeps doing this, and
knowing how to do everything because it is the Tao of the ancestors. In other words, you can sort of see yourself as the most recent version of your family's genes. And in all traditional activities, there's millions of years of morphogenetic fields stored up for how you pick something up, how you sit something down. So in the immediate sense, the manifestation of spirit is appropriate activity. What it really is, I think, is some kind of hidden how-ness that makes everything be as it is. And that's what the spirit is. In other words, science describes the possible things that can happen. Science is the study of possibilities. And what nobody has ever answered is how is it that out of the entire class of possibilities, certain things actually undergo the formality of occurrence.
Yeah, I don't want to do it like this.
Somehow they are selected out of the class of the possible, and they become the actual.
Not cancel, but don't say.
The thing which mediates the coming into being of the actual out of the class of the possible is what I think the spirit is. It is the invisible hand, if you will. It is the guiding force. It is the invisible landscape over which becoming flows like a river. It defines, it creates. It is this telos that I mentioned, this attractor at the end of time. Yes, back there.
Yes, Terrence, has there been any research that you know of in relation to electron spin resonance recently since the invisible landscape? And secondly, can tryptamine act as a mechanism for release of genetically stored material through that ESR, electron spin resonance, with an interpolation of tryptamine along
this one won't work.
Substances into the neural DNA? In essence, is that a genetic mechanism for racial movement?
Well, in the invisible landscape, that's what we were suggesting, and the invisible landscape was published in 1975. Since then, there's been a lot of work with NMR and ESR, none of it which overthrows this idea. It's a real question about where is the epigenetic data stored? In other words, all the memories that you accumulate during your life die with you. Your genetic material you can pass on at least half to your children. And so during the life of the individual, this epigenetic material, experience, anecdotes, memories, anticipations, where is it molecularly stored, or is it molecularly stored? In the invisible landscape, we were suggesting that thought is actually a naturally occurring ESR readout of portions of the DNA which were not associated with genetic expression, but which were somehow like writable memory in a computer. The epigenetic stuff was being stored there. There's
See
no
if this can
data
work
to
right here.
overthrow that notion that I'm aware of. I don't cling to it as strongly as I once did. I look more and more. I didn't realize that this was a fundamental break, this allowing of spirit into the scientific model of the world. And I now think of the brain as a receiver of the phenomenon of consciousness. That I don't believe that consciousness is generated in the brain any more than that television programs are made inside my TV. You know, the box is too small. You know, it just obviously is too small. I mean, it might not be if you didn't have the psychedelic experience, but once you splice that and you say, well, it's taking, 10 high 16 megabytes of memory to store this database, so it just doesn't, I just don't think it would be done like that. I think that there is somehow this field phenomenon that I keep returning to. This is another slice on what the spirit is. It is this field of some sort of energy that organisms, as they evolve, discover, right? Already somehow present in the environment. It is the appetition for being that drives organic evolution into this kind of dance of relatedness to this other thing which it can transduce from another dimension. That's why, if you take consciousness expansion, the phrase, or consciousness enhancement seriously, it must be very important, because consciousness is, after all, what it's all made out of. That's the name of the game. So this transducing of higher states of consciousness then seems very important. Even at that, it will be necessary to elucidate the physical mechanism, whether it's ESR, NMR, or what it is. An interesting sort of opportunity for psychedelic research. You see, the amazing thing about psychedelics is not only that they are illegal and restricted from the so-called ordinary person, but they are restricted to scientific research. Nobody can do research on psychedelics. I mean, it is professionally and practically impossible to do it. Well, there's no other area where this is true. I mean, science probes obscenely into the most private areas of our sex lives, our social lives, our dream lives. Monkeys are smashed against walls to study. I mean, there's no limit to it. And yet there's this total hands-off attitude.
The other ones they
toward
automatically
the
cut all that
psychedelics.
out.
So an interesting break in this front is the sudden need, because of computer-assisted tomography, CAT scanning, the need for compounds which locate in certain highly defined parts of the brain. If you could tritiate these drug compounds and make them radioactive, you could make very nice pictures of various parts of the brain. So now suddenly there is an interest in all this old psychedelic research about the receptor site and location densities of molecules in the brain. So we may be on the brink of an era where to have a psilocybin trip in the evening, you must have signed on for a CAT scan at General Hospital in the morning. Someone else.
Well, I have a couple of questions. I guess I'd like to hear just about the state of these plants that you feel that you need to sort of rescue them from the Amazon and bring them into Hawaii, and how many types of plants there are, and that kind of thing.
Well, every time I have gone to the Amazon plant collecting, I've observed that the cultures, the indigenous rainforest cultures, are more and more disrupted. And there's a lot of conservation and big organizations raising money to preserve the rainforests and to get large tracts of rainforests set aside. But there is no awareness or social conscience about the fact that the presence of capitalism in the Amazon is totally disrupting tribal human culture. So these people who have been tribal for thousands of years, the men are just totally walking out on the traditional lifestyle and taking their canoe 100 miles downriver and signing on at sawmills and on oil drilling crews and this sort of thing. And so the consequences of this is that far more rapidly than the rainforest itself is being destroyed, the human cultural interaction with the rainforest is being lost, and thousands of species of medicinal plants, antibiotics, immune stimulators, hallucinogens, analgesics, all these different kinds of plants, this data, this lore is being lost. And when you realize that, 80% of the drugs sold in the United States are in fact traceable to plant sources, and in spite of the vaunted success of so-called strategic pharmacology, where you just think up the drug you think you need and make it in the laboratory, it's still a lot of what drug companies do is screen for plants and cash in on folklore, basically. So it's important to preserve these plants
This one might not work.
and the lore about them, because you see, it's really hard to explain how some of these plants have been discovered. For instance, in the case of ayahuasca, ayahuasca is a visionary shamanic brew that happens to be made of two different plants. Banisteriopsis caapi supplies an MAO inhibitor, and Psychotria viridis supplies DMT. Either plant by itself is inert, and you have to know to brew the wood and bark of one with the leaves of the other.
Say that again.
Plants, antibiotics, immune stimulators, hallucinogens, analgesics, all these different kinds of plants, this data, this lore is being lost. And when you realize that, 80% of the drugs sold in the United States are in fact traceable to plant sources, and in spite of the vaunted success of so-called strategic pharmacology, where you just think up the drug you think you need and make it in the laboratory, it's still a lot of what drug companies do is screen for plants and cash in on folklore, basically. So it's important to preserve these plants and the lore about them, because you see, it's really hard to explain how some of these plants have been discovered. For instance, in the case of ayahuasca, ayahuasca is a visionary shamanic brew that happens to be made of two different plants. Banisteriopsis caapi supplies an MAO inhibitor, and Secotria viridis supplies DMT. Either plant by itself is inert, and you have to know
MAO
to brew
inhibitor. I'm about to
the
look that up right
wood
now.
and bark of one with the leaves of the other, and you have to know that it's in a certain proportion, and you have to know to concentrate it to a certain degree. Well, when you realize that a square mile of Amazonian rainforest can have 120,000 species of plants on it. I mean, that's in contrast to when you go into the Sierras, a square mile of forest may have 150 species of plants in it. So it's an ultra-complex environment, and human beings, who knows by what means? I mean, it is, to my mind, that the vegetable spirits lead them to it, have sussed out all this knowledge that is, a seamless web of understanding about nature. And so this is what we're trying to preserve in Hawaii. I think ayahuasca is a good example. It has tremendous potential for psychiatry. It is a purgative. It kills intestinal parasites. It appears in agar, in slant culture, to kill the trypanosome of malaria. Well, instead of delivering high-priced drugs made in Germany and the United States to the outback of Indonesia, where malaria is raging, you could simply send in thousands of cuttings of this plant. People could grow it as a dooryard plant, take it as a tea on a weekly basis, and malaria would be held at bay. There are over 200 plants in a recent review article that I saw known from Africa that appear to be immune-stimulating plants. Well, God, this should have everybody on the edge of their seat. The breakdown of the immune
Looks like it's
system
stuff
and
that
the whole
basically helps people in
AIDS-related
those,
complex and
like
all of that.
depression and some other things. That's what they
It
probably
turns
use that
out
chemical out of that
that
plant for.
adaptations to plants in traditional cultures have conferred or have stimulated the immune system and conferred certain kinds of immunity. Well, then this could be the basis for a drug strategy of some sort, and so on. So this is the kind of preservational work that we're doing there. Yes, against the wall.
Yes, Karen, thank you. A few days ago, you were on KPFK with Roy, and you mentioned briefly San Pedro. That's what you said, right? You were talking about the exotic plant, the San Pedro cactus. I believe. Could you just give me briefly background, maybe a parallel between the experience or your experience if you had it with San Pedro to that of psilocybin mushroom? Because when I tried San Pedro cactus, mixing it with vanilla ice cream didn't work.
Well, I don't know what work means, but it must have startled your stomach. It was pretty vile.
And I didn't know what I was doing.
Well, I don't really know that much about San Pedro. I've never gotten around to it. I know a person who swears by it, but they have a elaborate way of cooking it up in a pressure cooker. Mescaline, and halamine, unhalamine, and methylmescaline, all of these things are occurring in that plant. It's an amphetamine-related thing. It tends to be pretty rough. Of the natural hallucinogens, the big ones, as I think of them, mescaline is the harshest. An operating dose is considered to be actually close to a gram, 700 milligrams, which one way that pharmacologists judge the toxicity of a drug is by how much it takes to get you off. And the less it takes, then the more benign the drug is thought to be. So on that scale, mescaline doesn't do too well. But my experience with mescaline has been with peyote, which I gather is somewhat similar. And it's been interesting. It's hard to take enough to really reach the deep water without it really reacting on your stomach. It's not the cleanest way to go. I think that, having looked at these things in South America and in many places, in my experience, the mushroom just is it. I mean, other things have other aspects to it and bring it in, but the mushroom is an extraordinary organism. It's like it's engineered for that purpose. And I've spoken about how it was almost strewn in the path of developing primitive man in Africa because it was associated with the manure of cattle, and the ungulate herds of Africa evolving on the veldt at the same time that the human animal was evolving a complex pack signaling language and so forth. It just set the stage. It seems to me it was the catalyst. I really believe that we are in a symbiotic relationship with these plants, and that the mushroom, by virtue of being global in its distribution, is probably a major slice relationally of that pie. And in other words, that the peculiar turn that evolution took in our species, the reinforcing of self-reflective consciousness and the reinforcing of linguistic signaling, has to do with the presence in the human diet in that early stage of these mushrooms. It's known that that low amounts of psilocybin, subthreshold doses of psilocybin, increase visual acuity. Well, it isn't hard to figure then that if evolutionary pressure is operating on a hunting species, a pack hunting species, that visual acuity is going to be at a premium. And if small amounts of psilocybin in the food chain increase visual acuity, those animals will be selected and survive. Well, then their habit of accepting the mushroom as a food lays them open for this linguistic synergy, this symbol forming capacity, and then the deeper, more ecstatic experiences with psilocybin, which are then projected onto the mushroom, onto the cattle, become the basis for a kind of cattle goddess mushroom, a cycle of a hierophany, the discovery of the tremendum. I mean, almost as though in the scene in 2001 where the apes encounter the monolith, it was precisely that, except that the monolith was a mushroom. It was a superbly genetically engineered omnivorous organism that could insert itself into the ecosystem of a planet and begin to coax an effect out of a mammal that it had a relationship to. And this effect coaxed out of the mammal is this relationship to this higher dimensional waveform, which we call the spirit or mind, which is apparently, that's what it's all about. Why this is happening is not clear. I mean, in the mushroom book, I suggested that it was because there is some awareness of planetary finitude.
Here we go.
That the mushroom actually thinks on so large a scale that it is using us to make machines for it, to perpetuate it throughout the nearby galaxy, that it is aware of the finite nature of our star. We don't know. We don't plan yet on those kind of scales. We're an infant race, very obstreperous, and the mushroom said to me once, if you don't have a plan, you become part of somebody else's plan. And one of its slightly more paranoid but it is good, I think, to have a plan and to have allies, and the mushroom is very contemptuous of the notion of humans having human allies. It says, for one human being to think it could gain enlightenment from another is like for one grain of sand to think it could gain enlightenment from another. So it really believes in, hierarchical levels and trickle-down gnosis, which I'm not sure how I view that. I believe all secrets should be told, and that we should just lay our cards on the table. But maybe I don't have as many cards as they do, so we play by their rules. On the aisle.
You're a wonderful, convincing speaker. I'm sure nobody here needs to be have any self-doubt or doubt what you're saying. But in case they do, I want to bear witness and testimony to what you're saying. It's absolutely true that there's this intelligence that wants to connect to us, and that we need to make every effort to connect to, because, as you say, it's extremely informative. And you're saying that one way we can do this is through the psychedelic experience, which I agree with, it's not for me. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Western tradition of the mysteries, which involves ritual, and using ritual in order to maintain, maintain contact with this nature spirit, which I might add is a spirit that's just bursting at the seams right now to connect to us and inform us and talk to us and help us.
Yes, well, Marcillion talked about the difference between sacral and profane time. And he said the way you leave history is you sacralize a space. And you sacralize a space through ritual. You abolish the profane constraints of space and time, the here and now, and you imagine that you are what he called in ilio tempore, in the time before, in the paradisical time before the fall. This goes back to what I said about the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, the imagining of these titanic godlike states of mind as a ground for being. Yes, I would never have thought, I mean, I've been pushed to my position by my experience. I mean, I'm amazed at what I have to say based on what I've experienced, because I never thought it would be this way. You know, I came up a whole different way. I was a Marxist and an existentialist and all of these things, and it was, as you testified, it's the pure evidence of it. I mean, you can convince yourself intellectually that something is true, but it's only in the embrace of the tremendum that it just sweeps over you how true it is. And as far as the difference between establishing these connections through psychedelics and through ritual, I think deep psychedelic tripping is something that you don't do very often, simply because each time it's so rich. It takes a long time to process this stuff. It's much better to go deeper seldom than to diddle with it in the other ways that people do. I mean, it often seems to me that it's not even so much a matter of spreading the good word and turning it into a mass movement. It might be much more interesting if simply the people who were already in on the secret did it more conscientiously and more deeply. Although I hasten to add that you shouldn't do too much. You should never do more than about 6 or 7 grams of mushrooms. I say that because I keep hearing stories about people who think going deeply means doing a lot, and they do amounts which stand my hair on end. I mean, in the past month, traveling around, I've heard stories where I just say, and people are crazy. Say, I couldn't remember whether you said 5 grams or 5 ounces. So to be safe, I did 1.5 ounces. I mean, it's important to it's important to get there, granted, but it's important to come back. Oh Lord, yeah.
In your talk, you said something about the transcendental object. Could Could you go into more detail on that?
The way I imagine that history works is, well, first of all, let me say how the way the people I disagree with think it works. And then you had cooling and development of atomic and molecular and organic and ultimately cultural and systems and ultimately technological systems. And this will go on indefinitely down unto the heat death of the universe, and the development of life and of culture has nothing to do with the physical, astrophysical level of things. It's sort of ancillary and a mistake. My view is somewhat different. It's that if we have to have a singularity in our
Damn, this
cosmology,
froze up.
in other words, it's so hard to figure out how you get from nothing to something. No philosophical school has ever been able to do it without some kind of singularity. So if we're going to have a singularity in our system, let us try to make it as logically palatable as possible. So how to do that? It's not logically palatable to me to believe that the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant. Seems to me if you believe that, you're set up to believe anything. Right? I mean, isn't that it? Say, well, if they'll believe this, what wouldn't you believe? So how about this instead? That the universe, its origins are a mystery and cannot be determined. But as we look at its history, the history of it that is available to our inspection, what we see is increasing complexity, ending in ourselves and our civilization so far as we know. Well, then if you're going to have a singularity, I think of a singularity as a kind of phase transition. You know, Ilya Prigozhin talks about how a chemical system will suddenly and spontaneously migrate to a higher state of order. Well, that's sort of how I think of this thing. It is capable of migrating to a higher state of order.
Alright, so I just have to change the order of this, of
if
these
we're
words.
going to have a singularity,
'Cause this
isn't it
isn't gonna
more
work.
likely that it will emerge out of a situation of vast complexity than a situation of utter metaphysical nothingness? I think so. So I think that what the transcendental object is it is the cause of the universe, if you will, except that this cause is at what we would conventionally refer to as the end. It's what everything flows toward. It isn't something wound up which runs down. It's something diffuse which is gathered in to something. And this gathering in takes the form not only of a progressive densification at the physical level, but of a progressive complexification at the organizational level. It also is a kind of a spiral. It has a temporal closure, so that each epoch of closure happens more quickly than the ones which preceded it. And what I mean by that is, it took the universe is 20 billion years old. The first 5 billion years, the first 10 billion years, it's all about star formation and nuclear cook-down of heavier elements out of lighter elements. And then you get molecules, which signify a higher level of organization, which can only go on at a lower temperature. So as temperature leaves the universe, more complex systems become possible.
BAM!
And then ultimately, polymers of great lengths become possible. So this complexification is occurring, and it is at each stage more rapid than the last. Now, the emergence of self-reflection in our own species is part of this. It isn't a fluke. It isn't an accident. It is obedient to the same natural law which created these other systems. And the emergence of our own curiously alienated and at odds with itself culture is also a part of this phenomenon. We are initiating a kind of crisis with the planet. It is in the same way that a fetus will become septic if it is carried too far beyond term. There is a crisis now in the Gaia human system. The two must be parted. And the transcendental object is this knitting together of the organic intent of the planet to somehow expel us from the planetary environment in some way which is very hard for us to foresee and anticipate, because it is in fact the transcendental object. I mean, by appointing a committee to look into this, we are not going to find out what it is. It is the face of the abyss. It is the transcendental object. It cannot entirely be known. It is the living embodiment of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. You know, science has taught us that there are no mysteries, there are only unsolved problems. This is a mystery, not an unsolved problem. Nevertheless, it is the narrowing vector of our timeline. And as some of you probably know, in my opinion, around 2012 AD, we will cross through novel epochs of concrescence, and the transcendental object will be manifest. It's a very curious thing. It's something which is coming toward us from the future, but we are creating out of our intellectual and technological anticipation of deity, really. I mean, at times I've spoken of it as the flying saucer. It is the flying saucer, and it does enter history at a certain moment, and it is coming toward us, but as we go toward it, we are becoming what we behold. In effect, what I'm saying is that the entirety of human history is a kind of psychedelic apotheosis, where we are involved in a hierostelmos, a kind of alchemical
Let's see how that
marriage.
looks.
And what the,
Go ahead and take a look,
what the
save
next
that.
25 years are
Let's stick it
about
over here.
is advancing to meet the bride.
Delete.
And the bride is the unimaginable
Place.
and anticipatable fulfillment of our heart's desire. You know, we are becoming what we behold. Our metaphysical hypostatization of deity is becoming a cultural program for our completion. And that's why communication is so important, because what we're trying to do is articulate this vision of the oversoul of our species. We are going into a kind of swarm state, or
60,
there is a pheromonal transformation of our cultural modalities. Our pheromones are information systems, and now information systems, ideologies are being released into the mass psyche that actually set us up to undergo this cultural compression and concrescence that the experience of the transcendental object is. If you haven't read William Gibson, you might give him a go. His anticipation of a cybernetic future is part of the anticipation of the transcendental object. And what Gibson is saying in Neuromancer and Count Zero is that data storage in hyperspace will become conventionalized the way the grids of cities are conventionalized in three-dimensional space. So that when you jack in to cyberspace, you will find, you will see the Bank of America database like an enormous red neon oblong glowing off to your left, and over the horizon the Trans World Airlines database. In other words, the dimension of culture, which for 15,000 years or so has been, for purposes of comparison, let's say, as thin as a thick sheet of paper. I mean, what has culture been? It's been a few mud huts, some brick streets, a cathedral here and there recently, and then more recently a lot of knitted together, electrified, cheap construction. Suddenly, the dimension of culture is about to be, which is orthogonal to ordinary reality, is about to be expanded 100, 1,000-fold into a complete mind space, the cyberspace that Gibson is talking about, the psychedelic space that shamans have always known about, is about to be activated as a cultural artifact in high-tech society, where we will become whatever we imagine. You know, you will move off into this electronically sustained realm of mind. At least that's how I imagine it. I imagine that passage through the transcendental object leads into the imagination, and that the imagination is really our true home, and that all of this electronics and culture and art and drugs and magic and ritual is about the prodigal return to the imagination as a cultural norm. And the transcendental object represents the narrow neck, the narrowest place, the place where the phase transition occurs. At least that's what I hope. That's what I feel the symbiosis with the hallucinogens is coaxing out of us. Because we cannot go to the stars in the ape mindset, you know, with ape politics, and it's just impossible. And very clearly, we are on the brink of taking control of our own self-image. This is what the long cultural march has been. This is the justification, if there is one, for science, is that it does give us a certain measure of control over stuff. And it is the mirror of our minds that we will make out of stuff that we will eventually perform this magical evocation in front of and walk through into the time outside of history, the place before history.
That's crazy.
Another question. Somebody over here. Yes, sir.
Terance, welcome to LA. People who listen so many hours on the radio, I just want to say we really love you. And I just think that's what I have to say. Although I have to admit, I take the show on my VCR and I get it during the day. But anyway, I was going to go to Mexico to a little village up in Oaxaca, and my companion sort of convinced me that it might not be the best idea because while you're looking around for green men, you might find some federales or something, and it might not be the best place to totally let go. So I decided to grow some mushrooms, and that just ended up on the low priority of things that I still haven't grown them, you know? But I was always of the fantasy that going to this place in Mexico, there was something magic there. And there was this quote-unquote morphic resonance. And I wanted to know, if there was a morphic resonance, wouldn't that be in the negative time-space frame? And so my question is, one, do you buy this morphic resonance idea? And
That's the question.
yeah.
Well, one of the best people, one of the very, very best people that I've found in the so-called New Age is Rupert Sheldrake, and he and I are tight, and we've spent a lot of time just pushing these ideas around. Ultimately, I think probably he's very much onto something. It's interesting that it's considered such a radical idea, because think about what it says. It says that things are as they are because they were as they were. One can hardly imagine a more conservative philosophy. In fact, the problem for this philosophy is to therefore explain how anything ever manages to be different, how any kind of novelty could emerge out of a situation where the past is so present that it configures everything. So Rupert's idea and my idea, which I haven't discussed except by implication tonight, but I have this notion, which is embodied in the software, of a wave of novelty, a way of quantifying the flux of the Tao. And a wave of novelty would be necessary for Sheldrake's idea to support the coming into being of new forms. I mentioned this evening in the main body of my talk the term compressionism. I've just sort of begun to think about this. I like it because I like impressionism, abstract expressionism, surrealism. I like it because it's an art movement, not a science. But I would number the compressionists who come to mind to be Rupert Sheldrake, Ralph Abraham, Frank Barr,
Now
and
you just got to do the arms.
myself, bringing up the rear. And we all four of us have a slice on it, each different, but each leading to this same set of conclusions, that there is a set of hidden variables which we all describe differently, but that these hidden variables are channeling the development of events.
Okay.
And what this signifies is a new way of thinking about time, and it's all very much in flux. Rupert is a true great scientist and gentleman. If the theory of morphic resonance can be overthrown, it will be, and he will lead the charge. Our effort, when we get together, much of our effort is experimental design. We try to think of experiments that would disprove the notion, because it is a notion which asserts very firmly certain strange things about reality should be measurable and discernible. So morphic resonance, my novelty waves, the dynamic attractors of Ralph Abraham, and the fractal hierarchies of Frank Barr are all embryonic efforts. There's a feeling in the air, a sense of an idea to be nailed down. And I'm convinced, that in the next 10 or 15 years, one of us or somebody we know or somebody sitting at the table nearby will work it out. It's really the great intellectual adventure of our time, and it carries us all along with it. When this thing is figured out, it's going to be understandable to all of us. It's going to end the era of the professional abstraction. For the new paradigm to work, it's going to have to transform the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And that's the point that has been missed by the proponents of some of the more narrow versions of what the new paradigm is. The new paradigm will be an understandable explanation of the world.
So I'm done
understandable
after this,
to who?
sure.
To you, to me, not an
Made
abstraction
t-shirts, updated
sanctioned
the
by
Twitch
professional
and everything
elite
like that.
handed
Learned a
down
lot
by
today,
the academy.
just in this last shirt alone, about distorting it and also what I might need to do about making some more templates, because I'm running out.
Well, that's the beauty and the wonder and the delight of Time Wave Zero. Absolutely. I mean, this was produced to convince scientists. What this thing does is it draws graphs of the ingression of novelty into time. I advance novelty as a new primary quality of the space-time continuum on a par with charge, spin, angular momentum, novelty. This is the realm of the hidden variables. And this program makes thousands of experimentally testable assertions. This is not smoke and mirrors stuff. You give it an end date, you give it a date of interest, and it draws a mathematically defined graph of its opinion as to where the flux of novelty and habituation, these are the two opposed quantities, novelty and habituation, where they fall vis-a-vis this event system. So every time you activate the program, it fills the monitor with a screen full of precise predictions about known historical phenomena. So it seems to me, if there were a body of informed give and take on the matter, we could quickly settle whether it's just, that I smoke too many little brown cigarettes, or that this kind of thinking is in fact going to underlie and restructure science. It's all right. I mean, why should we assume that the basic qualities of the universe have been defined as of 1965 by modern physics? After all, modern physics doesn't explain the unicorn or the flower. So there must be more at work in the universal mix than we have perceived.
All right, that's it for tonight,
Well, I think
everybody.
I'll do
I
one
hope you
more
did enjoy. I might be on for
question.
some games or something, but that's it, at least from